Hello, everyone. Welcome. Can you hear me? Yes, thank you. Thanks so much for joining us tonight for what will be a vibrational exchange and immersive sound experience between Professor Karen Barad, Rasheedah Phillips, and Camae of Black Quantum Futurism. My name is Noemi Jangiro. I am the director of the Goethe-Institut San Francisco. We are the official German cultural center in the Bay Area, supporting cultural exchange worldwide. Tonight's event, Turning into Quantum, was curated by Lucy Rose Sollitt and commissioned by the Goethe-Institut in San Francisco, Ireland, London, and Beijing. It was organized with the great support of Bettina Wodianka and takes place with the generous partnership of Grey Area. Turning into the Quantum is the last event of the Living in a Quantum State program, which this year transitioned into Studio Quantum, a new international events and artists in residence program from the Goethe-Institut, exploring emerging quantum technologies through the lens of art. Current locations taking part in this residency program include Dublin, Lagos, London, Mexico City, and Bangalore. Here in San Francisco, we work together with the Gerasi Arts Residence Program. If you're interested to find out more, please check out our website at goethe.de/quantum. So before we get going, some information on the show flow and some housekeeping. This is how we imagine this event. We will start with a presentation by Professor Karen Barad, followed by a presentation of Rasheedah Phillips of Black Quantum Futurism. During these presentations, we will listen to the sounds of Camae. Please remember to post questions during our event tonight via the QR code that you can find on those sheets at the entry of the space, and I think some are also lying around on your chairs. And our contributors will be on stage also after the presentations to discuss their views and some of your questions. So please get curious and send in your questions. Please also remember to wear your masks tonight. We highly appreciate your care for yourself and those around you during tonight's event. Holidays are coming up, and let's try to stay healthy. That would be good. So I'm honored to introduce tonight's speakers and contributors. Professor Karen Barad is Distinguished Professor of Feminist Studies, Philosophy, and History of Consciousness at the University of California, Santa Cruz. They are also an affiliate in Critical Race and Ethnic Studies. Barad's PhD is in Theoretical Particle Physics and Quantum Field Theory. They held a tenured appointment in a physics department before moving into more interdisciplinary spaces. Barad's research focuses on the relationship between science and questions of justice. They are the author of Meeting the Universe Halfway, Quantum Physics and the Entanglement of Matter and Meaning, and numerous other works in the fields of physics, philosophy, political theory, science studies, decolonial studies, feminist, queer, and trans theory. Their research has been supported by the National Science Foundation and the National Endowment for the Humanities, among others. Barad is a co-founder of the UCSC Science Justice Research Center and the Science and Justice Graduate Training Program. After Professor Karen Barad's contribution, we will invite Rasheedah Phillips of Black Quantum Futurism on stage for her presentation. Black Quantum Futurism is an interdisciplinary creative practice between Camae and Rasheedah Phillips that weaves quantum physics and Afro-diasporan concepts of time, ritual, text, and sound, creating counter-histories and Black quantum futures that challenge exclusionary mainstream versions of time. Black Quantum Futurism has created a number of community-based projects, performances, experimental music projects, installations, workshops, books, short films, zines, including the Community Futures Lab, Black Women, Temporal Portal, and the Black Time Belt. The collective has been awarded manifold, among the awards a 2022 Creative Capital Fellowship and 2020 Arts at CERN Artist Residence. The collective has presented, exhibited, and performed internationally at various important platforms, including Documenta 15, Chicago Architectural Biennial, the Manifesta 13, ICA London, and Shanghai Art Biennial, and many more. Rasheedah Phillips is a queer housing advocate, a parent, a writer, an interdisciplinary artist, and cultural producer who uses web-based projects, zines, short film, archival practices, experimental nonfiction, speculative fiction, printmaking, performance, social practice, installation, and creative research to explore the construct of time, temporalities, and community futurism through a Black futurist cultural lens and experience. As a director of housing, Rasheedah leads Policy Links national advocacy to support the growing tenants' rights, housing and land use movements in partnership with grassroots partners, movement leaders, industry and government leaders. Previously serving as managing attorney of housing policy at Community Legal Services of Philadelphia, Rasheedah has led various housing policy campaigns that resulted in significant legislative changes, including a right to counsel for tenants in Philadelphia and the Renters' Access Act, one of the strongest laws in the nation to address blanket ban eviction policies having a disparate impact on renters of color. Their writing and artwork has appeared in the Funambulist magazine, Eflux Architecture, Flash Art magazine, Philadelphia Inquirer, Recess Arts, and more. Phillips is also the founder of the Afrofuturist Affair, founding member of Metropolarity Queer Speculative Fiction Collective, co-founder of Black Quantum Futurism, co-creator of the award-winning Community Futures Lab, and creator of the Time Zone Protocols, Black Woman Temporal Portal, and Black Time Belt projects. Last but not least, our third contributor tonight, Camae, or More Mother. She is a national, international touring musician, poet, visual artist, and professor, and has performed at numerous festivals, colleges, galleries, and museums around the world, sharing the stage with the likes of King Britt, Roscoe Mitchell, Claudia Rankin, Bell Hooks, and more. Camae is a vocalist in 3 collaborative performance groups: Irreversible Entanglements, More Jewelry, and 700 Bliss. Dear all, what amazing personalities we have on stage tonight. Let's welcome our first speaker of tonight, Professor Karen Barad, and the musician Camae. Welcome.
See, I'm just waiting for the slides to switch over. I don't see the projection from my laptop yet, so. What are you trying to do? Okay, well, I'll entertain you for a little bit while we're waiting for slides, because anyway, first of all, I wanted to thank, there are so many people to thank, actually. It could take the next half an hour. Yay, there's my presentation. So thank you for all the technical help. Very seriously, it took a lot setting this up, and thank you to my collaborators, and thank you to students, colleagues, friends, and other people who decided to spend the next 2 hours with us. So this has been a long time coming, but here I am in the space-time with Black quantum futurisms. I don't like stardom in academia, but I have to say that I am totally starstruck at this point. I can't believe that I'm finally here doing this with these amazing folks. Back in 2017, I offered a course I called The Politics of Space-Time and Matter, and the syllabus included props, these two amazing books, two edited volumes by Rasheedah Phillips, Black Quantum Futurism, Space-Time Collapse from the Congo to the Carolinas, and Black Quantum Futurism, Theory and Practice. I was so engaged with the materials that following our discussion, my students encouraged me to find a way to contact Rasheedah. I thought about it, but I was too shy, and I never tried to contact them. Years later, while Zooming into a meeting of a reading group I participated in on physics and Black study with Fred Moten and Denise Da Silva and other colleague friends, I found myself in the same set of squares, face to face with Rasheedah and Camae. It was a thrill to connect, and it has been a pleasure, an absolute pleasure to be in conversation with these incredible artists, thinker, activists. Sometime later, we received an invitation to do a public conversation with one another. That's this event. And after more than a year of planning, this very special event has arrived. So I'm deeply honored to share the stage this evening with the amazing Black Quantum Futurism, Rasheedah and Camae. So I often have the challenge, well, I think I have the challenge every time I speak about explaining some physics and also then doing what I want to do with it. So it takes me a lot of time. So this was a real challenge trying to make a half-hour presentation. I'm afraid it's going to go by, that means pretty quickly, because either I could skip how the argument goes and not bring you with me and abbreviate it, or I can talk a little fast. But if I'm going too fast and things go by, just let it wash over you. You're probably absorbing more than you think anyway. So, all right. In one way or another, since graduate school, I've been committed to finding an alternative way to do physics. Even as I have this love for physics, I understood from the beginning its ties to the military-industrial complex, and that if I was to engage with it in a serious fashion, I needed to find a way to be responsible for that which I love. Since that time, in one way or another, I've been busy with a two-pronged project. One, tracing all the forces, political and social. Whoops. This is a loose connection here. Sorry. So tracing all the forces, political and social as well as physical forces, imploded into its core, seeking out how traces of these forces are written into the very equations. And two, finding and experimenting with deconstructive possibilities, radical possibilities for undoing the material conditions of the forces of violence and opening up what I am now calling an energetics of the otherwise. I'm just finishing up a book by that title. To give you one example, my wager is this. While condensed inside the nucleus of an atom is an implosion of violent legacies, sedimented historicities of colonialism, racism, extractivist capitalism, and militarism, there are also seeds of their downfall and possibilities for living and dying otherwise. The point is to do physics otherwise, to bring forward an alternative way of doing physics. Some people think that when I speak of quantum physics that I am giving over the standard account, but that's not the case. For one thing, there is not one agreed upon standard interpretation of quantum physics, but rather multiple conflicting ones. In this talk, and most of the time, whenever I say quantum physics says, or according to quantum field theory, I likely mean my agential realist relational ontology interpretation, a specifically political physics that doesn't introduce politics nilly-willy, but rather brings political dimensions of physics to the fore rather than hiding or denying them. For decades, I've been working on putting forward an understanding of the physics in a way that makes it more responsible. Indeed, to understand objectivity as a matter of responsibility. Since my specialization, quantum field theory, helped produce the atomic bomb, one focus in my work has been on nuclear colonialisms. Nuclearity is implicated in exploding more than cities. On the one hand, it entails the ultimate fulfillment of a Newtonian dream to map all of space-time and colonize the globe and beyond. But it also contains inside its very core its undoing, or so I've claimed. For Newton, physicist extraordinaire, inventor of the calculus, author of biblical prophecies, uniter of heaven and earth, continuity was everything. It gave him the calculus, and the calculus gave voice to his vision of a deterministic world, placing knowledge of the future and the past in its entirety at man's feet. Prediction, retrodiction, time reversal, time universal, man's for the asking. The price but a slim investment in what is happening in an instant, any instant. Determinism rules. Nature is a clockwork, a machine, a wind-up toy. The omniscient one started up at time t equals 0, and then even he lost interest in and abandoned, or perhaps remembers now and again and drops in to do a little tuning up. The universe is a tidy affair. Jumping to the 20th century into the nuclear world, Newton is not only behind the time, his sense of time is shattered. Nuclearity explodes clock time. Nuclear matters cut into the core of questions of temporality and blast apart sedimenting conceptions of clock time such that time becomes manifest as unhinged, out of joint. Here, I'll show you a bit of what I mean. Nuclear bomb blasts are not events in time. They occupy time, colonize it, do violence to it. Exploded nuclear bombs continue to go off long after the flashes of light, heat, and sound have settled, littering fields of futurity for generations to come. Deep time, both deep histories and deep futures, intergenerational mutations, out of timeliness itself leaching into bones and groundwater, atmospheric particulates of split seconds raining down, frozen bits of time hardened into glassy residue, shattering histories and futures measured out as afterlives, half-lives, half of a half of a half, counting radioactive bits without end. The very existence of nuclear decay undermines eventfulness, writing a temporality of ongoingness into the core of radioactive material existence. Nuclear decay is not a singular event, it pervades time. For example, uranium-238's half-life is 4.5 billion years, meaning that in 4.5 billion years, half of a sample of U-238 will have decayed. In another 4.5 billion years, a half of that half will have decayed, and so on. Radioactivity counted out across innumerable generations, left ticking eons beyond time. The first nuclear theory can be traced back to the work of Japanese physicist Hideki Yukawa, who in 1935 proposed a theory of the nuclear force as consisting of the exchange of a virtual particle, that is, in terms of quantum field theory. So in an important sense, nuclear matters have always been matters of quantum physics. There was no classical theory. Nuclear physics developed alongside and inside quantum field theory, and many of the top physicists around the world were working on both. Physicists began working on quantum field theory in the late 1920s, but quickly ran into difficulties, most seriously the so-called infinities problem, which was not resolved before the war. Histories of physics mark the war effort as interrupting the development of the theory, at least in the West, because the same physicists who were hard at work on quantum field theory were called on to take the lead in developing new military technologies, including the secret project of the development of the atomic bomb at Los Alamos. This is not a coincidence, nor did this so-called interruption constitute a break. Skills, techniques, approaches to cracking hard problems and more were traded back and forth between military research and the most abstract efforts in theoretical physics. In fact, I have argued that it is possible to trace the forces of militarism, colonialism, and racialized capitalism down into the core core of the theory, which remains wedded to clock time despite being the ultimate quantum theory. I have also been at work trying to subvert the violences written into the theory by exploring ways in which it is possible to bring forward a shattering of core concepts, including clock time within quantum field theory, thereby exploding sedimented elements of Newtonianism and its concordant principles of individualism, essentialism, universalism, and reductionism that exist inside the theory. In this way, it is possible to rework the grammar and logics of science's sense of the nature of nature, cracking open and liberating possibilities of critical engagements with its own core. The clocks were arrested in Hiroshima on August 6, 1945 at 8:15 a.m. Time stopped. Its internal mechanism melted. What happens to time when nuclear forces are harnessed and unleashed? Was the very fabric of time being not ripped apart, shredded into bits, vaporized, dispersed, made particulate, whisked away on the breeze, condensed into raindrops that fall to the ground, making puddles on streets and quenching the soil's thirst, sent up in smoke as the water invades the electrical systems of nuclear plants, leaked into the groundwater as the nuclear core melts. Time is, was, has been crossed out. Time drawn out like taffy, twisted and swirled in the form of hot metal, cooled, hardened, and splintered. In the 20th century, time is given a finite lifetime, a decay time, an afterlife. Moments live and die. The bomb in Hiroshima continues to go off. In the immediate aftermath of the bombing, those who survived the blast instinctively made their way to ground zero, making the usual kinds of assumptions about the nature of an event, as they would with a conventional bomb, in order to look for survivors. But this was no ordinary bomb, and it hasn't finished going off. Many who survived the original blast were further exposed to radiation as a result. Some died as a consequence, others lived, but their cells tick like little time bombs that explode into cancers, or they pass mutations on to future generations. Living and non-living beings become carriers and transmitters of radioactivity without end. When it comes to nuclear landscapes, vaporized bodies and other losses may not be visibly discernible, but they are surely not intangible. There are losses emblazoned on walls, shadows of what once was become eternal. The flash so bright, the heat so hot, nearly every surface becomes a photographic plate. Loss is not absence, but a marked presence, or rather a marking that troubles the divide between absence and presence. The body clocks of Hibakusha, nuclear bomb survivors, have been synchronized to the bomb. Their cells tick with the rhythms of radioactivity, half-lives indeed. Passed along to future generations through mutations, the bomb continues to go off all these years later, while nuclear violences cancel out futures, individual and collective, even deep futures, how to ensure the safety of buried radioactive events, half of a half of a half of a half, counting time out by the tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of years, possibly beyond human time. While the dominant American imaginary, give me one sec, I want to play this while I talk. While the dominant American imaginary is that only 2 atomic bombs have ever been exploded, blasts that killed more than 175,000 people in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and that these 2 isolated events ended a war. During the so-called Cold War, ironically named, more than 2,000 nuclear bombs were detonated, the overwhelming majority of them on indigenous people and lands. And this doesn't even begin to count the colonizing forces of slow violence and not so slow nuclear violences that are an integral part of the nuclear fuel chain, including uranium mining, processing, and nuclear waste storage, which disproportionately affects indigenous peoples. For example, the US Environmental Protection Agency and the Navajo Nation have identified more than 523 abandoned uranium mines scattered throughout Arizona and New Mexico, including dozens located dangerously close to homes or water sources. And while we've all heard of 3 Mile Island, few have heard of the Church Rock uranium mill accident. It was, in fact, the largest nuclear accident in US history, involving the outflow of 100 million gallons of radioactive tailings. More than 1 ton of the contaminants were deposited on Diné lands. This accident occurred just a few months after the accident at 3 Mile Island. How many people have heard of this? A few. In 1947, the UN established the Strategic Trust Territory, giving the US control over 2,000 islands spread across 3 million square miles of the North Pacific Ocean, a proportion of which was designated the Pacific Proving Grounds, which constituted an open-air nuclear laboratory and arena for showing military might. Between 1946 and 1962, a part of the project, the US conducted As part of the project, the US conducted 105 atmospheric and underwater nuclear tests, many with extremely high yields. 67 nuclear bombs were exploded on the indigenous lands of the Republic of the Marshall Islands alone, and the Marshallese people and ecologies are still paying a high price. When people think about the Hawaiian nuclear history, perhaps what they remember is when the emergency alert system went off at 8 a.m. on January 13th, 2018, warning of incoming nuclear missiles. But the imaginary that nuclear war is only an unrealized possibility rather than a material history needs to be exploded, as we've seen. Consider Operation Fishbowl. Starfish Prime, part of Operation Fishbowl, was the largest high-altitude nuclear test conducted by the United States. The hydrogen bomb was exploded at an altitude of 250 miles above the atmosphere, at about the height where the International Space Station orbits. It was launched from Johnston Atoll, just 900 miles west-southwest of Hawaii on July 9th, 1962. So here's a view of the explosion from Honolulu. It disabled satellites and artificially produced an aurora that lit up an enormous area of the Pacific and could be seen as far away as New Zealand. Quote, "It looked as though the heavens had belched forth a new sun that flared briefly, but long enough to set the sky on fire," unquote. It also produced its own radiation belt around the Earth, which lingered in the atmosphere for 5 to 10 years after the blast. Lest we think nuclear colonialism reaches its limit when it encompasses the entire Earth. Reaching beyond the planetary, nuclearity promises a world of violence without end. Space, the final frontier. When it comes to the project of colonization, militarism, and empire building, it matters how we understand the nature of space and time. Is it possible to reconfigure these notions inside the science in ways that explode sedimented concepts that aid and abet these projects, releasing an energetics of the otherwise? So now I want to move on to show you some of the ways in which I've been experimenting with queering and deconstructing Newton's notion of time, among other concepts that are part of quantum physics. I'm going to very briefly talk about 3 possibilities, and if you want to learn more about this, you can look up a paper that I wrote called Troubling Times and Ecologies of Nothingness, Returning, Remembering, and Facing the Incalculable. This section is called Space-Time Diffraction and the Superposition of All Possible Histories. Diffraction is a matter of patterning attuned to differences. Waves make diffraction patterns precisely because multiple waves can be in the same place at the same time, and a given wave can be in multiple places at the same time. Particles do neither. By definition, particles are localized entities that occupy a position in space. They can be here or there, but not in 2 places at once. However, it turns out that what we think of as particles can produce diffraction patterns under specific circumstances. How can this be? According to quantum physics, this is because a given so-called particle can be in a state of superposition. To be in a state of superposition between 2 positions, for example, is not to be here or there, or even here and there. Rather, it is to be indeterminately here-there. That is, it is not simply that the position is unknown, but rather there is no fact of the matter as to whether it is here or there. That is, it is a matter of ontological indeterminacy about what is, and not merely epistemological uncertainty about what we know. As a result of this indeterminacy of position, particles can in fact exhibit diffraction patterns under particular circumstances, or to put it the other way around, when they do exhibit a diffraction pattern, it is an expression of the fact that they are in a state of superposition. Note that while it's tempting to say that a given particle in a state of superposition is in 2 places at once, this is a simplification that doesn't fully capture the complexities. For one thing, a particle by definition, remember, has a determinate position. It's either here or there. And furthermore, if one were to perform a measurement to directly test the hypothesis that a particle is in 2 places at once, then it wouldn't be. Because a particle whose position is detected will behave like a good particle and only ever show up in 1 place at a time, even though the pattern produced when the position isn't being measured can only be accounted for as if it were in 2 places at once. That is, if it behaves like a wave, in which case it isn't a particle. Patterns of differencing, diffraction patterns, are arguably at the core of what matter is and are at the heart of how quantum physics understands the world. Physicist Richard Feynman formulated quantum physics based solely on the notion of diffraction. Unlike in Newtonian physics, there is no determinate path that a particle takes in going from one position to another. That is, no such path or trajectory exists. But what physicists can do is calculate the probability that a given particle that starts out here will wind up there. The quantum probabilities are calculated by taking account of all possible paths connecting the 2 points. In other words, a given particle that starts out here and winds up there is understood to be in a superposition of all possible paths between the 2 points, or in its four-dimensional quantum field theory elaboration, all possible space-time histories. Crucially, on my agential realist account, these possibilities are not to be thought of in the usual way. It is not that each history is merely possible and ultimately only one will be manifest or realized. As I stress in my account, the very meaning of a superposition is that all possible histories coexist and mutually contribute to the overall pattern, else there wouldn't be a diffraction pattern. Now, the next thing I want to share with you is something uniquely a part of my agential realist interpretation. The fact that quantum physics opens up another possibility beyond the relatively familiar phenomenon of spatial diffraction, namely temporal diffraction. And during the Q&A, I'd be happy to show you the experimental evidence for this. Indeed, it is possible to do a diffraction experiment in both space and time, whereupon a single particle will show itself to be in a superposition of places and times. The existence of temporal diffraction is due to a less well-known indeterminacy principle.
In the liquid time series installation, a participant's physical motion in the installation.
As interesting as that would be, I don't want to, I don't want to have this sound, so let me, it's not letting me do that. Let me shut down my sound. Okay, there we go. The existence of temporal diffraction is due to a less well-known indeterminacy principle, the time-energy indeterminacy principle. As a result of this indeterminacy principle, a given particle can be in a state of superposition of different times. For example, this one particle right here between my fingers can be in a state of coexisting at multiple times. For example, yesterday, today, and tomorrow. Temporality is not merely multiple, but rather temporalities are specifically entangled and threaded through with one another, such that there is no determinate answer to the question, what time is it? This takes a bit of getting used to, even more so than spatial diffraction, but temporal diffraction has in fact been observed experimentally, and in an important sense, although it's not usually talked about in this way, it lies at the core of quantum field theory. This section is called "The Past is Not Past, Tracing Entanglements in the Material Traces of Erasure." Here's another idea from agential realism based on a further exploration of diffraction. Recall that the famous two-slit experiment can be used to show that particles under the right conditions exhibit wave behavior, namely they produce a diffraction pattern. This pattern would be expected only if each particle goes through both openings at once, as a good wave does. In other words, the particle is in a superposition of going through both slits. On the other hand, if you modify a two-slit by adding a device to measure which slit a particle goes through, it does in fact go through one slit or the other, like a good particle, contributing to the creation of a scatter pattern, not a diffraction pattern. Now suppose we first do a two-slit experiment showing that there is in fact a diffraction pattern, that is, it behaves like a wave, going through both slits simultaneously. And then we add a which slit detector, and as we expect, there is no longer a diffraction pattern, but a particle pattern. Now we try something both outrageous and clever. Suppose we erase the which slit information, will we get a diffraction pattern back? seems unlikely, but interesting, because in the absence of witch-slit information, it should behave like a wave. But now there's an interesting temporal twist, because it already went through one slit or the other, like a particle. Well, it turns out that when an experimenter adds a device that enables the erasure of the information about which slit a particle goes through, after it's already gone through the diffraction grating and hit the screen, remarkably, a diffraction pattern can be detected, indicating that each particle will have gone through both slits at once. This raises the seemingly impossible possibility that one can determine after the fact whether the particle will have gone through one slit or the other, like a particle does, or through both slits at the same time, like a wave, after it already passed through the diffraction grating and made a mark on the screen. The claim made by physicists who proposed and conducted the quantum eraser experiment is that this is evidence of changing the past. They speak of the diffraction pattern as having been recovered, as if the original pattern had returned, and the witch slit information having been erased. But I have argued that this interpretation is based on assumptions that are being called into question by this very experiment, assumptions concerning the nature of being and time. It's important to slow down and carefully examine the evidence, because the nature of time and being, or rather, time being itself, is in question and can't be assumed. For one thing, these physicists underestimate the nature of the evidence at hand. What this experiment tells us is not simply that a given particle will have done something different in the past, but that the very nature of its being, its ontology in the past, remains open to future reworkings, whether it will have been a wave or a particle, which are defined to be ontologically different kinds. In particular, I have argued that this experiment offers compelling empirical evidence for a relational ontology, or hauntology, and against a metaphysics of presence. Again, happy to say more about this during the Q&A. Crucially, this diffraction pattern, however, is not immediately evident once the information is erased. That is, it is not the case that the original diffraction pattern returns. Rather, a new diffraction pattern can be found within the scatter pattern if and only if the experimenter is clever enough to know how to trace the existing entanglement. This point is crucially important, for the labor expended in tracing the entanglements, including figuring out how to find the extant entanglements and then tracing them, is a necessary step in making the experiment work. Remarkably, this experiment makes evident that entanglements survive the measurement process, and furthermore, that material traces of attempts at erasure can be found in tracing the entanglements. Indeed, these experiments show that while it is possible to erase particular marks that seem to suggest that the past has changed, it is a fantasy to believe that there is a past that exists back there, that has now been changed, and that this constitutes an erasure of all traces of history. This experiment demonstrates something truly remarkable, that erasure itself is a material practice that leaves its traces in the very worlding of the world. I have argued that an interpretation that seems to be in better accord with the empirical evidence than the one offered by the experimenters is that the past is not past, not given, not back there. Rather, pastness is a process that entails an ongoing reconfiguring of space-time mattering in the iterative materialization of the world. The past is never finished, and the future is not what will unfold. The world holds, or rather is, the memories of its iterative reconfigurings. All reconfigurings, including atomic blasts, violent ruptures and tails in the fabric of being, of space-time mattering, are sedimented into the world in its iterative becoming and must be taken into account in an objective analysis. This third section quantum field theory and remembering the undoing of self and a counter politics to colonialism's avoidances and erasures. There's a third aspect of this radical undoing of Newtonian time that I cover in the paper Troubling Times, but I don't have time to do it justice here. So I'm going to only very lightly touch upon what is a remarkable set of openings and possibilities. Land occupation as a mode of empire building has been and continues to be tied to a logics of the void. Justification for occupying land is often given on the basis of colonialist practices of traveling to so-called new lands and quote-unquote discovering all matter of quote-unquote voids. The doctrine of terra nullius is one such tool of empire building. Whatever the specific nature of the alleged absence, a particle understanding of the notion of the void defines the colonizing practices of avoidance and erasure. The void occupied a central place in Newton's natural philosophy. Newton insisted that the void was a spatial frame of reference within and against which motion takes place. Matter is discrete and finite, and the void is continuous and infinite. The void extends indefinitely in all directions, and bits of matter take their position in the void. All in all, the void is quite literally universal, and therefore only very sparsely populated. And since property rests with matter, it's one of its founding characteristics. The absence of matter is the absence of property, and also the absence of energy, work, and change. The void in classical physics is that which literally doesn't matter. While the so-called voyages of discovery bringing data, including astronomical and tidal changes culled from European journeys to non-European sites, aided Newton in his efforts to develop a natural philosophy that united heaven and earth, Newtonian physics helped consolidate and give scientific credence to colonialist endeavors to make claims on lands that were said to be devoid of culture and reason. If classical physics insists that the void has no matter and no energy, the quantum principle of ontological indeterminacy, in particular the indeterminacy relation between energy and time, calls into question the existence of such a zero energy, zero matter state, or rather makes it into a question with no decidable answer. Not a settled matter, or rather no matter. And if the energy of the vacuum is not determinately zero, it isn't determinately empty, since energy and matter are equivalent, E equals mc squared. I don't have time to show you how this principle undoes the classical notion of the void, although I've just hinted at it. But just to say, on my agential realist account, the void comes to the fore in ways that challenge even the unusual ways the quantum vacuum is described. Let me give you a taste of a taste. On my account, the void is a lively dynamism of indeterminacy, a desiring orientation towards being, becoming. The vacuum is far from empty. Rather, it is flush with yearning, with innumerable possibilities, imaginings of what was, could be, might yet have been, all coexisting. The void is a lively tension, a desiring orientation towards being, becoming. The vacuum is flush with yearning, bursting with innumerable imaginings of what could be. The quiet cacophony of different frequencies, pitches, tempos, melodies, noises, pentatonic scales, cries, blasts, sirens, sighs, syncopations, quartertones, allegros, ragas, bebops, hip-hops, whispers, whines, screams are threaded through the silence, ready to erupt, but simultaneously cross-cut by a disruption, dissipating, dispersing the would-be sound into non/being, an indeterminate symphony of voices. Don't for a minute think that there are no material effects of yearning and imagining. Virtual particles, quanta of vacuum fluctuations are experimenting with the im/possibilities of non/being, but that doesn't mean they aren't real. On the contrary. Consider this headline. It's confirmed. Matter is merely vacuum fluctuations. The article explains that most of the mass of an atom, its nucleus made of protons and neutrons, which constitute the bulk of an atom, is due not to constituent particles, the quarks, which only account for 1% of its mass, actually less than that, but rather to contributions from virtual particles. The void can no longer be thought of as that which doesn't matter. As a result of the time-being indeterminacy, the electron does not exist as an isolated particle, but is always already inseparable from the wild activities of the vacuum. I go on to show that the consequences of this is that the vacuum is constantly touching itself through touching all others in all possible ways, as well as transforming its identity into other kinds in a radical undoing of kind, property, individuality, and other Newtonian foundational concepts. Matter in its essence, and this is precisely what is being contested and undone here, is radically queer and trans. It is constantly undoing and redoing itself, responding to all matters of yearning to become otherwise. Matter on this account is a dynamic infolding and involution. It can't help touching itself. And in this self-touching, it comes into contact with the infinite alterity that it is. The other is not the foreigner, but on the contrary, the stranger at home. Perhaps there's something to learn from and with that, a way to tap into an energetics of the otherwise, in the thick now of an infinity of possibilities. Thank you. Thank you, Camae, for the accompaniment.
Thank you. Thank you so very much, Professor Karen Barad. This was absolutely remarkable, your presentation on nuclear colonialism and violence, deconstructing time, and also the radical potential of quantum field theory. Thank you so very much. Thank you also, Camae, for your absolutely outstanding and absolutely amazing sounds. I think it really contributed to this presentation. It was absolutely wonderful to have this together. Thank you. So please remember to pose your questions via the QR code. Let it sink in, but if you have questions, please remember to send them in. I'm very, very honored and happy to now invite Rasheedah Phillips of Black Quantum Futurism on stage. Welcome.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much. Yeah, it's just such an honor to be able to create this abundant space-time with Professor Barad. So appreciate being able to be here. We are born into institutions. Our very first breath and vision of the world outside the space-time of the womb is taken between the four walls of an institution. Like newborns to an umbilical cord, we remain tethered to institutions for all of our lives, dependent upon them for sustenance, protection, health, welfare. These institutions built on stolen land are the great European fathers' stone playgrounds, testaments of patriarchy. Within these stone playgrounds, they have created the space-time that we all abide by. The timeline brought to you by Einstein, Newton, Galileo, and other long-dead Europeans, contradicting our experienced reality and the wisdom of our ancients. We hold their truths to be self-evident. The system plays to the audience's perceptions. In mimetic, genetic, quantum, urban Darwinism, certain structures and myths went out over others, and the eternal game played inside the arena of this particular space-time. An after effect of the electromagnetic crisscross path created when the atom... Male, female, electric, magnetic, but information from the future is constantly falling into indeterministic gaps in the present. But we see what we have always seen when we don't expect to see differently. The observer's bias, the reason why the conditions of our universe is the ideal incubator for the breeding of galaxies, stars, and planets. Thermodynamics, the theory by which we hold our notions of cause and effect is only statistical in nature and overly concerned with equilibrium. Though it purports itself to be concerned with process and change, its eventual goal is always the equalization of change, but if change is equalized, it becomes static, with no appreciation for the dynamic processes that make change what it is. Under the regime of thermodynamics, becoming collapses into being like a piece of light collapsing into a wave or particle, suddenly shy when observed. The arrow of time defined by thermodynamics must be dissolved. Feedback from the future must guide the development of the present and the past. And science is the ultimate political body. The mind-body split, the dualism that persists into present times, the reason why classical physics and quantum physics seemingly contradict. Blinded by its own so-called enlightenment, thusly setting light and dark as opposites, eternally at odds inside of the cascading, chaotic universe. But science is really the resulting end of a negotiation. The laws and principles that we hold to be commonly true about the universe and the world were all shaped by the hands of a privileged few. For many of us, the indoctrination of mechanical linear clock time begins at a young age. In school, we are taught to plot major events, world history, and even our own lives onto a straight line that runs horizontally from past to present to future, with time coming from behind us and moving forward. On this progressive time on a straight line, you can only understand information flowing in a forward causal direction, where cause and effect are neatly isolated into their respective temporal binaries, moving time forward in lockstep manner. On the classical level, an event's effect can never precede its cause. There's a built-in limitation of light as an information medium, moving 1 second by 1 second into the container of the future. The container is usually predetermined by a calendar date and/or clock time, and the arrow of time presumes an arrow of progress that itself presumes a direction pointed straight ahead, one that we will always need to be on the right side of. The arrow of time, foreclosed from reversing its course, creates the conditions that cement us into the present, which is why many people cannot perceive or interpret future information until they arrive into it, except as deja vus and dreams that are forgotten upon waking. We fail to see the portents of the future because the future supposedly collapses upon interaction with the present or the relative past. Science and social reality has convinced us that the future has no bearing upon our present actions, or that our relative present actions have no bearing upon the so-called past. Exploiting quantum properties of time and temporality offers us additional possibilities outside the limitations of Western linear time. On a quantum nonlinear spatial temporal orientation, modes and dimensions of time have endless degrees of freedom for interaction. For example, experiments testing pairs of photons show that one photon from a pair knows in advance what its twin photon would do in the future. And other experiments have shown that quantum particles display features of retrocausality, where particles reach back in time to influence the properties of other particles in the past, even before the experimenter has made their choice. In other words, a decision made in the present can influence something in the past. African and Afro-diasporan temporalities and traditions of time share many parallels with quantum principles. The past intermingling with the present, interwoven with the futures. Dynamic. Past and future variables can be held in superposition, existing in their infinite states of possibility, open to influence, collapsing into reality, uncollapsing back into superposition at will. If one repositions their temporal lens, one may meaningfully disrupt progressive linear notions of time, actively creating radical visions of non-local futures, quantum nows, unpredictable paths from are typically denied access to creative control or temporal modes and timescapes. We know Western linear time to be an ill-paid, oppressive, clunky technology that will eventually be supplanted by quantum realities. It is impractical to expect immediate or equitable for an ancestral time consciousness and practices for Afro-descendant peoples. However, to continue to develop, share, and fortify temporal practices and ethics consistent with our experiences as diasporic displaced Africans, living in communities largely assimilated into linear progressive time constructs that constantly leave us behind. In the evolving framework of Black quantum futurism, we converge quantum physics, Black and Afro-diasporan temporal consciousness, and the spatial politics and poetics of Black existence. This conceptual scaffolding serves not merely as an intellectual pursuit, but as a praxis that collapses the boundary between theory and application, between metaphysics and lived reality. In embodying these theories, We become both the cartographers and the terrain, mapping temporal and spatial features that manifest in personal, communal, and societal realms. BQF endeavors to disrupt the normative, hierarchical structures inherent in linear time, challenging the traditional chronology that often subjugates Black communities. BQF also actively engages the future as a construct in our work, understanding the future as a layered and expansive space that is not only forward-looking, but entangled with multiple temporal dimensions. The word future designates a time period or temporal space that is not now, but one that is situated ahead of us, distinctive from times that precede the ones in which we are currently situated. According to the Oxford English Dictionary, it developed out of the Old French futur during the late 14th century, denoting a time after the present, yet to be. Derives from the Latin futurus via the view to grow or become, which is the future participle of the word esse, to be. Both esse and future share be at their root, which may explain why the word before both denotes an event that has already passed and that's now in the past, or an event that has not yet happened. In April of 2018, Black Quantum Futurism held an exhibition called Black Space Agency, which explored these dynamics via a group art show and community-based programming that we curated. Marking the 50th anniversary of both the Fair Housing Act and the founding of Progress Aerospace Enterprises, one of the first Black-owned aerospace companies in the United States, our exhibition interlaced historical events such as civil rights, the Fair Housing Act, and the space race, with issues such as affordable housing and gentrification. We sought to stimulate collective memory and provoke critical thought on the interconnectedness of past, present, and future struggles for spatial agency and temporal autonomy. For our programming, we utilized the phrase Black Spacetime Matters to articulate the significance of recognizing and materializing Black temporalities and spatial experiences within the Western timeline, operationalized through movements like the Progress Movement and Progress Aerospace Enterprises, and made material through Black reclaiming and utilizing of our ancestral temporal consciousness, such as so-called colored people's time. Drawing direct parallels to River Barad's Space-Time Mattering, Black Space-Time Matters uplifts Black temporalities as unique modalities and relational space-times wherein Black communities and people interact with time, space, and matter in specific ways that are divergent from hegemonic Western scripts. In this expanded understanding of Black temporalities, space and time and matter are united into a single term to emphasize the ways in which the three are critically engaged, co-constituting and acting upon one another. When Black space-time matters, it transforms our understanding of time and space from being neutral or benign backdrop to becoming a field of actively shaped by and implicated in Black experiences. Black communities inherently construct and inhabit our own dynamic and textured temporal spatial realms. Here, past and future, along with dimensions that defy conventional temporal categorization, are held seamlessly in superposition. These realms resist collapsing into oppressive linear timelines when subject to observation through a so-called objective white gaze. The communal time experiences within Black communities emerges from a rich mosaic of intersecting times, stories, rhythmic patterns, ultimately re-engineering the infrastructure of the future's temporal domain. We hold out hope for disrupting the temporal prison of the here and now, to allow access to past and futures with the same privileges as the present. Your point from the present can itself be a reference point for determining what both the past and future look like, as well as a point of departure from which possible action can take place. Feedback from the futures must guide the development of quantum nows and plural pasts towards a deepening of colored people's time, towards a reclamation of healthier communal temporalities. During the summer of 2013, I was wrapping up research and putting the finishing touches on short stories for my first self-published book of speculative fiction, Recurrence Plot and Other Time Travel Tales. Simultaneously, the germination of those ideas would later take shape as Black quantum futurism was beginning. As I delved deeper into topics on quantum physics and time, I encountered a crucial acronym, CPT, which stood for change, parity, and time, a cornerstone concept in physics. But then my mind immediately flashed to an alternative version of that acronym, one that I was all too familiar with, colored people's time. This derogatory stereotype has long been wielded against Black people, implying a perpetual lateness among Black people as a whole. As I stared at the two acronyms side by side in my notebook, the realization of this profound link burrowed itself into a corner of my mind. And in the years to come, I would continue to explore those linkages. CPT symmetry, or change parity time symmetry, charge parity time symmetry, is a fundamental principle in physics that states that the laws of physics remain unchanged under the transformation of particles into their antiparticles, charge conjugation, the reflection of space, which is parity, and the reversal of time, which is time reversal. In other words, if we take a physical description of a system, execute the three operations of C, P, and T on that system, and then compare the results to the original description, they should be identical. In other words, CPT symmetry tells us that the fundamental laws of physics should be the same, regardless of whether particles are transformed into antiparticles, whether the spatial coordinates are inverted, or whether the direction of time is reversed. When I saw the call for applications for the Arts at CERN program on a list of artist opportunities in 2020, it felt eerie, felt too good to be true for me, and so I applied and we got the fellowship. And our project was CPT symmetry and violations. It was a comprehensive exploration of the varying scales and dimensions of time and temporality, personal, interpersonal, communal, global, and cosmic. Through the nexus of art and science, we focused on interrogating the nonlinear and subjective aspects of time and dissected the juncture where temporal lines cross, links, distortions, reflections, dictated by one's location on the so-called timeline. I spent a total of 2 months in residence living on the campus of CERN, which is the largest particle physics lab in the world, engaged with over 30 theoretical and experimental physicists, engineers, and astronomers on questions of time and to learn about their investigations of time in physics. Shortly after the first half of that residency, we held a solo exhibition at Red Cat in Los Angeles called CPT Reversal, drawing directly on our research at the CERN laboratory and our exploration of colored people's time. One of the central works of CPT Reversal was the Black Hole Viewfinder, which offered a simulated glimpse into a black hole where information defies destruction. Black holes are both mystifying and formidable. Theorized by Albert Einstein's 1916 theory of relativity, black holes emerge from cataclysmic events where a massive star exhausts its nuclear fuel and collapses under its own weight into an infinitesimal point. Characterized by an intensive gravitational force, black holes trigger phenomena like light bending and time dilation. Their presence and resulting processes can influence cosmic events and formation of new galaxies. Yet they harbor a deep-seated paradox. According to quantum mechanics, information entering a black hole can never be destroyed and must be conserved, while general relativity argues that anything enter a black hole is lost forever. Under these circumstances, information is considered all the data or knowledge contained within an object or system. This includes all the characteristics that make something unique and that distinguishes it from other things. This paradox represents an unresolved conflict between quantum mechanics and general relativity on the fate of information swallowed by black holes. And as such, the paradox shakes the foundations of our understanding of reality and brings CPT to the forefront. One point on the lineage of our understanding of black holes points to the Western understanding of light. While in some cultures light and dark is viewed as complementary, notions of darkness within Western scientific discourse is grounded in an ontology that perceives light and darkness as opposing forces rather than interdependent, interacting facets that depend on one another to exist and that do not pre-exist absent each other. According to biblical traditions, black is considered the darkness before time began, and that without it, the earth was without form and void. The first few lines of the Bible had God calling for light, and upon seeing that the light was good, he separated the light from the darkness. The discussions among philosophers and color scientists alike have also led to the assertion that black is not considered a color. In the dictionary of symbols, black sucks in color and does not return it. Above all, it suggests chaos, nothingness, night sky, night shadows on the ground, evil, anguish, sorrow, the unconscious, and death. Philosopher Roy Sorensen attributes these complexities surrounding the status of blackness to an aversion to negative things, elucidating that other colors are seen by virtue of light simulation. The light itself can be colored, but cannot be black. From this perspective, darkness is devoid of carrying information, while light allows us to observe or perceive information. Under the causal theory of perception, the act of seeing is intrinsically linked to causation. In other words, something is seen because it serves as a cause for what is seen. The linear causal model introduces the notion of causation through absence, suggesting that anything, in quote, anything that fails to act on our minds through our eyes is invisible to us, end quote. Underlying these theories is the idea that we see black holes for the same reason black hole destroying my information right now as we speak. All right, well, I'll keep going. It's okay. Underlying these theories is the idea that we see black holes for the same reasons we perceive black letters against a white background. Black holes absorb light rather than reflecting it. This is in part due to a long-standing scientific view that absences do not transmit energy or do anything else positive, end quote. The matter of whether darkness and light are separate but equal forces had already been settled by Newton when he provided proof that darkness merely constituted the absence of light, making light the default. According to this Western conception of reality, darkness technically doesn't move, as light does. In their work, Diffraction, Professor Barad also challenges the notion that darkness and light are at odds, noting that the famous two-slit experiment in quantum physics queers the binary light-dark story, end quote. Barad proposes darkness not as mere absence or a lack, but rather as an abundance. Similarly, a paradigm centered on Black temporalities and Afro-diasporan epistemologies sees Blackness as abundant, which could be applied to Black holes. Such a view reinterprets the cosmic entities as a transformative force that doesn't negate, repel, annihilate light, nor does it neutralize or eradicate information. Instead, it preserves and metamorphoses information in ways that remain enigmatic, emergent, and contextual. Within African epistemologies, darkness emerges as a potent force that both conserves and reshapes information. The Dictionary of Symbols notes, for example, that, in quotes, in the West, black is the color of mourning, yet originally it was the symbol of fertility. In ancient Egypt, for example, and in North Africa, being the color of rich earth and of rain clouds. If it is as black as the ocean depths, it is because the underworld contains the treasury of hidden life and because it is the storehouse of all things, end quote. In this reassessment, darkness emerges as a potent force that both conserves and reshapes information, while black holes can create, not just destroy, space-time. Similarly, African perspectives generally do not conceive of space as a mere void, nor is blackness void or devoid of information. Rather, it is a sacred vessel, intrinsically interwoven with the spiritual and metaphysical dimensions of the universe. Further, blackness under these notions doesn't violate the speed of light or the principles of special relativity, as it doesn't transmit the type of information that relies on Western notions of light and information. Deemed a non-signal analogous to shadows under the Western notion of time, light, and dark, darkness theoretically moves faster than light because, to quote Sorensen, as, end quote, no signal can travel faster than the speed of light, end quote. This reimagined perspective envisions darkness as moving at a pace comparable to, if not faster than light, unburdened by the constraints of physical motion and unaffected by attempts to measure itself or be measured against light. The velocity of darkness isn't predicated on movement. It is inherent to its very essence, defying the need for movement at all, a notion which may seem paradoxical or contradictory in Western epistemologies, but that transcend linear thinking and causal perceptions. And I'll end with a quote: shadows, like other holes, can survive the destruction of their originators. Consider a tree that is constantly illuminated as it petrifies into stone. The stone continues the shadow begun by the tree, end quote, by philosopher Roy Sorensen. And then I'll leave with my own words, that our own shadow mimics the shadow of a black hole. The shadow is the keeper of memories and possibilities, actively recording every moment it's with you, using the light emanating off the body like a camera. It also captures the alternate world and possibility of any choice not chosen. Some shadows can be trapped, captured in the form of events, and tapped into for brief moments of time. The matter of our body is merely the hologram between the shadow and the light. The shadow self records and mirrors every action. In the mirror, it is amplified. If you tap into that recording, you find the shadow memory. Activate the shadow as the time machine of the self. Use the shadow to retrieve hidden information lost at the point of space-time collapse. If you jump all the way through the black hole and reach the other side, would you be turned inside out? Could you start all over? Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Rasheedah, Phillips, and Camae of Black Quantum Futurism for your deeply thought-provoking performance tonight on the radical potential of quantum. You showed us the possibilities in quantum realities and the parallels to African Afro-diasporan temporalities and consciousness. We learned about the binary notions and matters of dark and light, and how to empower spatial agency and temporal autonomy. Thank you so very much for your contribution. I would now like to invite both Rasheedah Phillips and Professor Karen Barad back on stage to have a wonderful discussion. Thank you so much. Remember, there are questions you can send in. If you haven't yet, please do so now. I think our wonderful speakers are able to see some of the questions that might have come in already. And I think Camae might join us also in a little bit. Thank you again.
Okay, there. I guess Camae wants to bring. I think she went to the bathroom, so we can start. Okay. Okay. Let me put down some of this because I've got too many things. So, wow. Thank you so much. That was so amazing. And
Same.
that's how I felt, first reading your edited volumes, and the way in which you were picking up on the physics and pushing it to deal with itself is something that I've been trying to do from a very different positionality for a very long time. And the way that you pick up on things like retrocausality, which was actually something that people were really, Feynman and his advisor Wheeler were actually pushing for in terms of solving the infinities problem in quantum field theory. I was like, who is this person who's talking about retrocausality? There's so many different themes that I would love to talk with you about. I have all these scribbles I can barely read now, but just thinking about the last part that you were talking about in terms of blackness and darkness, and the ways in which I think, one of the things that we're both doing from very different positionalities is really trying to get physics to own its shit in a certain kind of way, if I can say it like that, that this opposition between dark and light just doesn't hold in terms of the physics of it, but the same story, the same kind of Newtonian rhetoric gets repeated ad nauseum, right? Exactly. And that there wouldn't be a diffraction pattern, for example, unless light plus light gives black. Right? So it's like this, real abundance of light that is blackness. It's not absence, it's not lack, as you've also, brought to us in these important kinds of ways. And I was just wondering if you could speak a little bit about, what that is, where you're coming from and how you have this felt sense of what to push on. I mean, I heard your experience about CPT, which again is another, really central concept in quantum field theory. It's like the sacred concept, charge, parity of space-time and time reversal. And I love the fact that you guys were doing CPT symmetries and violations, because just CP together, there's a violation of that for the weak force. Anyway, I would love to know, we've hardly had a chance to talk with one another, and I would love to know a little bit about your engagement with physics. And and then, where that sense comes for you about what things really need to be pushed on, because there are these, like, for me, like Newtonian remnants that really need to have a lot of pressure on them. So I was wondering if you could speak to that.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. And again, just an honor to be up here with you. And lots of questions and things. And I was trying to like prep for my thing while listening to you, and lots of scribbles on my notes too. So, but yeah, for me, a lot of it starts with time and entering through time. So I have, since I was a child, written and thought about science fiction and loved and enjoyed science fiction. And then for a period of time when I was growing up and starting to sort of understand understand what I was ingesting in terms of things like time travel and time, and just it started off with like, oh, Black people don't time travel, or there's no vision of me in these kind of places. But then when I went to college, I had a friend give me a copy of Octavia Butler's Kindred novel, and that was the first time I had ever read or encountered a Black person traveling through time in this way. And even though it does contain some of the tropes of like going back to slavery and all these other things, what it did for me was like the fact that there was not a time machine made me really fascinated with like, how was this person traveling back? What's the mechanism? How is this person, this Black character, relating itself to time and temporality in this way that allows them to travel without this machine, which is the big thing that everybody needs. And then also, not to give away what's happening in Kindred, like the grandfather paradox element that is so heavy in time travel, and that all my life I've encountered, and it's fun, it's great to think about, but it's always like limited the possibilities of like, for a person like me, I'm like, I want to time travel in real life, how can I do this? But logically, science is telling me this is not possible because of something like the grandfather paradox. But Octavia Butler's Kindred just turned all of that on its head. Like, there's a grandfather involved, she's time traveling, there's no machine, she's a Black woman. So it really helped me to interrogate this notion of like, what does time mean? And if I'm going to be a writer and I'm going to be writing science fiction and thinking about this, and as a person who does not see science fiction as fiction, I see it as, there's a very thin line for me between what is real and what's fiction, especially when it comes to things like time and memory and time travel. It just inspired me to really like dig deeper. And then as I was like just reading about quantum physics and reading about the history, and just it was really interesting, and the contradictions became very evident in like reading about classical physics and the history itself. There was a lot of contradictions there. There was a lot of those contradictions became interesting, and like tensions that I wanted to pull at and try to figure out and unravel. So.
Thank you. Thank you for that. I'm thinking about how important in your work the everyday is. And this is, one of the really delightful and incredible things about sharing this stage with you is, I'm forever being questioned about the ways in which I'm somehow making a parallel or a metaphor or extrapolating between the so-called micro-quantum realm and the macro world. But this is completely false. I'm going to try again. Which is the fact that as far as we know, there is no line in the sand beneath which there's the quantum world, and only quantum mechanics holds, and above which only Newton holds. Newtonian physics happens to be a good approximation for large objects, that's all. As far as we know, the whole world is quantum, and in fact, we're seeing evidence of entanglements being shown amongst objects that are now macroscopic, as well as the fact that I can have an entanglement between the satellite and the Earth, and many more things. But also it's a question of ontology, right? It's Absolutely. A question of the fact of, part of my claim is that there's a relational ontology, and in fact, that means that scale itself doesn't exist. It doesn't pre-exist, just the way that you were talking about, that with, black space-time matters, the way in which the interimplication of those three, because I do like space-time mattering also, is so crucial because of the fact that it's a dynamism, and it isn't the background, and it's usually taken as the background, and that's why the matters part is so key to that.
Yeah.
And one of the things that happens in your uptake of CPT, of Colored People's Time, and rethinking also ways in which to bring the future back, and other kinds of things like that, your time traveling, is the importance of questioning also the sacred kind of boundary that usually exists between the object and the subject, right? That objects exist in time, but people experience temporality. And I try to, push on the fact that temporality is something that happens in the worlding of the world, that temporality is not limited to the human. In fact, where do we place it? How do we just drop the human in this conversation? So, so the everyday, I just want to come back to the fact that you have not just subjective sense of temporality, but in terms of the quantum, there is the temporality that is part of the way the world is in its ontology. So I'd love to hear your comments about that, and Camae as well, if you want to jump in now that you're back.
Yeah, and would also love to hear your take on this as well, and especially what in our conversation you've called the wave function collapse as a red herring, and sort of the sort of space-time collapse that happens that's supposed to be the line between the quantum and the big scale of things, and where do you see that line, or not, or erasure of that line? How do you envision that? But yeah, I think to answer your question, what was your question? What was your specific question?
I just love to hear more about the ways in which you're thinking temporality and how it's not limited to the human or what's in some thought bubble in terms of the experience of time as temporality, but the way in which you take temporality very, very seriously as being part of the way the world is, and the way that you're thinking about and rethinking and putting pressure on the notion of black holes, for example.
Yeah. You want to start?
I would just say the Community Futures Lab is a great project, and also just thinking about sound. Tonight I used a lot of bells. I don't know if you noticed, but I used a lot of different bells because the bell to me stretches throughout time, and it has so many particular meanings. And so by the time I get a bell at the percussion shop, it's this, €3 or something like this, but the fact that it speaks to so many levels that have been put upon, forgotten, renamed, all of these different, just really collapsing, So I try to think about instruments and natural, just things within nature that's used to make instruments, these things that are also codes or also tools of oppression, So I really try to, speak to all of those different temporalities.
Yeah, and I would love for you to also talk about your poem, Battlestar Galactica, and how you think about time through that poem and lineage. You talked about this when we were in Portugal recently, and I just love what you said about that.
Yes, so this particular piece that I wrote was all about time traveling through the race riots. And sometimes we are met with these particulars in history where we're like, how do we begin to dissect this? How do we begin to process or walk through this? And the race riots is not something that everyday people are like, yeah, I'll time travel through all the race riots. It's usually met with trauma. So we have this map called the quantum event map, which says that there's no set point on how you enter, a particular subject or a particular trauma event. It's actually the colors, it's actually the sounds, it's actually the objects, it's all these different elements that come together to make a certain now moment or past or future moment. So when I'm so-called time traveling through the race riots, I'm doing it with on my own terms, my own sense of agency of how to develop that. And one of my favorite writers, Toni Morrison, really is excellent in this idea of I can tell a particular story, and those who think they are the star of that story don't even have to be included. Especially talking about slavery, Toni Morrison speaks about not even including so-called Europeans in the story at all. It's still possible to tell this story,
Yeah, and I would say I, as a former lawyer and someone who represented folks who were losing their homes, I often thought about temporality and time within the system and within the systems that folks are caught up in, and particularly Black people and particularly people who are low income, who are inevitably caught up in various different systems that each have their own temporality. So if you're a person who's facing eviction, there's a temporality within that system, and then you may also be facing some criminal court charge that's whatever, and that system has its own temporality, and those two things don't really interact or entangle in the ways that they should, which leaves people sort of stuck in these narrow temporal bands that result in, them being pushed out of their homes or being cut off from their futures in these particular ways. And so we tried to bring those notions and ideas around time and temporality into our work. One of our projects was the Community Futures Lab, which was based in North Philadelphia, where folks were, the city was redeveloping that area and really pushing people out and erasing their history, erasing the memories of that community. And so we created a project called Community Futures Lab and did oral futures interviews with folks there, and just all types of ways of folks to challenge the sort of temporality of the government and the government futures that were being imposed on that community that was erasing their own sort of histories and their own futures of what they wanted to see. So those are other ways that we explore temporality in our work. Yeah.
Yeah, I'd like to add one more. There's a particular piece that's about Sandra Bland called From Chicago to Texas. And to begin to tell this story, it wasn't about interaction with just a cop and a wrong signal turn. To tell this story, I had to think about who built these roads? What is this journey from Chicago to Texas? And then doing that research, I find it's the same journey of horrors, So it's really getting into the whole story, or holistic stories about what's been stacked upon, stacked upon, stacked upon in a systematic way to really cut people off, from what has happened or what keeps happening.
Which goes to your point about infrastructures that you started with, right? And the possibilities of reconfiguring infrastructures, reconfiguring space-time mattering. And for me, instead of talking about infrastructures, I talk about apparatuses. So there are these entanglements and interactions between a variety of what you would call infrastructures, these various apparatuses of bodily production that are interactively entangled with one another, and which means there's no separability. There's differentiating, entangling as one move, right? Mm. And so, and in particular, what we see there also is another calling into question of the subject-object divide, because the apparatuses, the things that we learn about the object in physics are never separable from all of those apparatuses. And for me, the apparatus is not just the instruments in the laboratory, but there is no end to these apparatuses. There's the apparatus of colonialism, of racism, of gendering, and so on and so forth that are then help produce certain kinds of results. And that's what objectivity is about, is actually identifying what those apparatuses are and how they interact with one another to produce certain results. So that's a very different sense of objectivity than the usual sense that we have that science gives over, that somehow, you know, it's reproducibility of results or something like that. This is about accounting for things like erasure, for example, which is, you know, one of the key modalities of violence is, and here I'm saying no erasure.
Yeah, and I'm curious, what do you think about the possibilities for repair? You know, when in a world where we do understand space and time as always reconfiguring, and even the systems that we are trying to dismantle as always reconfiguring or finding a new route through which to operate, do you think there's possibility for repair of space-time, or is that even the right way to be thinking about it?
Yeah, that's a great question. I do think that there is something like repair that's possible, and it has to do with dealing with the erasures that can be found there in the traces of things. It can't just be a move to somehow you see a rift and you just want to like paste things together, right? That won't do it. It's really about, you know, you asked me about the collapse, and the collapse doesn't happen, and that's, you know, there's a certain kind of way in a lot of interpretations of quantum physics that says that you have a whole range of possibilities, and then you do a measurement and it collapses to one out of a multiplicity, and that's the collapse of the wave function. And what I'm saying is that these entanglements are actually extant. It's just hard work finding what they are. And that's the taking responsibility part and accounting for the erasures. And I think that's what's necessary in terms of repair and that kind of reconfiguring of space-time mattering to give us a different materialization of not only, you know, what is, but what was and might yet have been, as you also pointing out in your talk, and the ways in which the possibilities are themselves reconfigured.
Yeah, no, that's beautiful.
We're also supposed to be looking at questions here. Do you have?
I can pull my question.
Oh, okay. We're just going to take a quick.
While we're doing that, though, you said you would explain a little more about existence of temporal diffraction. I don't know if
okay.
there was more.
Yeah, I mean, I was just going to talk about the way in which you could do a physics experiment to actually show that there's temporal diffraction. So in order to show that there's spatial diffraction, I just have to have a separation in space between two slits, as I was trying to show in the diagrams about spatial diffraction. Now, instead of there being a separation in space, suppose the slits were separated in time. So let me give you an apparatus that might do that. I just cut out a circle. And I put a hole through the middle, and I put a dowel through it so I can spin the circle. I was told not to make hand motions and move the microphone away. So I can spin the circle, and I put a slit in it. Then the slit, you know, sometimes the laser's going to go through the slit. It'll match up, and other times it'll be blocked. So basically, what you have then is the possibility of a diffraction in time. And actually, when you do that kind of experiment, you do see a diffraction pattern and not a particle pattern. It's not like, you know, at a particular moment of time, they all go through and otherwise they don't. No, you see this weird alternating band pattern. So you really do see, you know, this diffraction in time, which is evidence of superposition in time, which is the possibilities of temporal entanglement, which is something else that you guys talk about.
Thank you. So it is 9 o'clock. I think we can maybe do 2 or 3 questions. I'm happy to read them, or is there one? More Mother, please tell us the kind of gear you're using to make your sound art and tell us why.
The gear tonight was just because I'm carrying one bag. I got the lemon drop, nano lemon drop. It's a really cool, tiny machine you can put in your pocket. I like it because I can share it with my students, and they've been doing some incredible stuff with it, more than I've been doing. And I'm also using an iPad. I used a couple different apps. I used a polyrhythm app. Whoever's interested in this, I can tell you the best apps. I don't want to go one by one with the apps, but you can just see me on the side, and I'll tell you the apps. But my favorite companies are SomaSense. They're from Russia. They make synthesizers that's not just for the stage, but for you to experiment at home, this kind of personal, intimate relationship with the machine. So Soma is who I like, and all their machines are like quantum and time this, and so I really enjoy that they're thinking not just on this realm or just this planet. So yeah, Soma, S-O-M-A. And I'm also getting into small percussion, so I bring it everywhere I go. Thanks for the question. What's another? What's that? Quantum leap?
Go for it.
Go ahead. Yep. Yeah, we know about it.
Camae likes it a lot. I think it's okay, but.
About the quantum leap. Camae, do you want to say what? I could say some things about it too, but do you want to say what you love about it?
Well, I mean, mine's just going to be really basic. I watched this show as a kid. I obsessed over it, and then they said there's a new quantum leap, so I just watch it because of, let's just leave it there. For me, I just, it's just something that space travel, time travel, I've always been interested, since a kid. So it's just, I don't know, it's just comforting. The TV show is comforting to me. I'm not recommending it, but it's comforting.
Okay. For me, the quantum leap has to do with a kind of jump that's an irregular kind of jump. It's actually a bad kind of verb to describe what's going on. So what you can have is, you get these spectral lines for different gases, and you put a prism there, or put a diffraction grating, actually, and you separate out different colors, and every atom has its own fingerprint, which is how we know what's in the sun. The elements that are in the sun, because you have these spectral lines you can identify, for example. So anyway, the point is that an electron, which is orbiting the nucleus, right? An electron is in different quantum energy states surrounding the nucleus, and it can be in a higher energy state, and then it can be in a lower energy state. And now what happened to that energy difference? It produces light, one of these particular frequency photons, as it makes this transition. Now, what's so weird about this transition is the following. It starts in a higher energy state, and it winds up in a lower energy state. And it doesn't do that in time. It doesn't do that in time. And also, there's a problem of causality here, which is the fact that if it's in a given energy state, it's stable, and so that it's not going to radiate away any energy. Same with the lower energy state. And yet it's never anywhere in between. That's the nature of the quantum leap, is it's there, and then it's there. And it's never, there's no continuous path between the two. So when did it radiate away the photon? It didn't do it when it was up here, it didn't do it when it was down there, and it was never anywhere in between. So we really have a puzzle here in terms of causality, which is something Niels Bohr recognized pretty early on, actually, which is why you need to push on causal relations, which, you know, retrocausality is one possibility, and interaction is another, because interaction says there isn't this, and then they interact with one another, but it says through an interaction, there's this and this that become differentiated within their entanglement with one another. So it's a very different set of causal relations.
So I just refreshed, and there's actually a bunch of questions. One question is, what is the opposite of nuclear colonization? How could quantum physics be used for positive impacts on life and the far future / deep future? And then someone asked, please ask this of Rasheedah and Camae as well. You may call it quantum colonization for their work. Thank you.
Go for it.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Well, for me, I don't think of it as opposite. Like, we don't think about our work in terms of decolonization. I think that implies a whole set of things that we're actually not doing. For me, I try to think of it in a more positive way of like, we are leaning into ancestral wisdom. We're leaning into other ways, quantum ways of thinking about time and temporality, black time and temporality. So I don't see it as opposite of colonization, and again, we just don't, I don't think that word applies to our work directly. So.
Yeah, I totally agree. I didn't know what to do with the question first because of the opposite, so thank you for dispelling that. Turning something on its head is usually not enough, and I think that I would, respond to a question about what to do with the harm being done on a continuing basis, and that still goes on about nuclear colonialism. And there I would suggest that the same kind of analysis in its particularities, always in the particularities and the specificities of these entanglements, to go through and do this thing of tracing the entanglements and dealing with the erasures and so on. I mean, in the Marshall Islands, there was that dome that I showed you was literally a hole blasted into Eniwatak Atoll, and then they put a bunch of nuclear waste in it and put a dome over it. And by the way, now it's being breached as a result of climate crisis. And so this shows you the way in which violences are never won.
What to add? I mean, you two are a good inspiration, about what's possible, and experiment also. This is something that's pretty big in our work as Black Quantum Futurism, and something that you said, River, earlier about sitting in it. Taking this time to sit in it to where it doesn't feel like you're overwhelmed or you feel like you're outside of it, So many, the way the systems are set up, especially the school systems, you have to get some sort of certificate to be able to think about something. And I think removing that, getting back to this, for lack of a better description, this kind of childlike wonder of saying, oh, I see that looks interesting, let me approach it. But not just approach it as in something you wear, actually sit in it and find these connections, not just with it between yourself, an intimate connection, but your community. And we speak a lot about, and I've been just bringing this up, all the different types of memory. You know, when we're thinking universal memory and cultural memory, you know, generational memory, all of these different things stacked upon. I don't want to go too far, but thank you for the question. Thank you for all the questions.
Yeah, just a real quick response to that. First of all, people have been calling me River, and there are certain people in the audience who also know me as River, and I just wanted to say I'm keeping that other name, my given name, as part of my professionalism, but I completely go by River at this point, so just spreading that around in the academic world. But also just to say about, you know, the conversation we were having backstage about sitting with it, about slowing down, because the temporality of, you know, capitalism, of racialized capitalism, is produce, progress, the progress narrative, and which means that certain people are behind time, right? Always behind, right? So, but also this push to produce, and also then for the pressure on students now to read everything that comes out, and you can't. You just can't. So to give yourself the permission to just sit with even what you're learning as a practice of learning, to really, really slow it down and to walk around in every sentence is what I was saying. I'm an extremely slow reader because I walk around in the sentences the way I was taught to deal with, well, the way that I learned to deal with equations. So there's a whole way of walking around in it and not just like skim. So this temporality of learning and slowing thought down is in some ways, you know, going against the grain of capitalism, and I think it's a really important practice.
Yeah, and I think that brings us to, I think, the last question, which is actually the conversation that we're having. Someone asked, does your understanding and acknowledgement of quantum realities and temporalities affect your daily ritual or routine, your quotidian concerns? How does it manifest in decision-making, intuiting? And then someone else also asked a similar question of, how do we as people relate to being particles in time? Can I be in multiple places, or how does it relate to our narrative of people and generations? So.
Yeah, I mean, just to continue, you know, what we're speaking about, part of my process before I start to work is this, get into the act of listening. You know, I don't assume that I'm listening, you know, this kind of thing. Well, I can listen, but you know this in your interactions with friends or whoever. Sometimes we can be looking at each other and still miss large parts of a story or a conversation. So I have to go through this practice of putting something on, you know, or going into nature and really getting in the space of listening. Then I can go and actually listen to something that I'm working on, you know, and it's also this act of emptying, understanding that we are taking in all of these signals and, you know, just we're pollution, we're plastic, we're taking in so much. So this kind of practice of, or you can call it a stream of consciousness, but it's just this act of writing with the intention of emptying. So you can start anew to actually get ready to write. It's just these ways, I mean, it is what you're saying, this kind of idea of slowing down, let's observe. This is an experiment. Let me try to see if this works for me, then I can skill share to my community. You know, and it's these trials, and I don't even like the word era anymore because it's always giving to the next circumstance or the next conversation.
Yeah, exactly. And for me, it's been this kind of like divesting, if you will, from fatalism and divesting from a linear, progressive narrative where everything's going to come to some end, right? So I've learned to think of time in more cyclical ways or more generative ways. And, you know, it's taken a long time to get to that point where you really feel and believe and can create and the life that you are living, ways to generate and be creative with time. And so I've been able to do that in my practice as a policy person and bring in temporality into how I think about the systems and the policies and things that I do, and figuring out ways to stretch time and through policy work and stretch time through legal work. So in that way, right, and it's also just a daily practice. It's bringing in these rituals, and that's why the word decolonization doesn't quite work for me, because it's so totalizing of like everything, if you decolonize, it's all right, and it doesn't really allow for a just transition. The fact that we have to continue to live in the world that we live in. I have a 24-year-old, I have to continue to work, I want nice things, I have to have a job, but I still can bring in other ways of dealing with time and other ways of dealing with space and integrate that into my life. So that's how I think about it. I don't think about it like there has to be some totalizing way that I've extracted myself from linear time. That's just not the reality. It's always going to be interacting, and so how do I make it the most positive interaction that I can and generative and bring in my own ways of experiencing time, so yeah.
Yeah, I want to come at this from the other direction, which is, what does it take to live in linear time? What kinds of mindsets and infrastructures bear down upon a person and are threaded through them such that they can live life in that way? I mean, you started to allude to it. One of the things I talk with my students about when they say, how do you think about living these times? I'm like, how long did it take you to learn linear time? Like, this is what we do with kids up till 8 years old, it says in the literature. You have to ingrain it into them to know what 5 minutes is. That's why parents do this thing. We're leaving in 10 minutes. We're leaving in 8 minutes. We're leaving in 7 minutes, over and over again, because it takes an enormous thing to integrate this conception of clock time and how we run it. And then, so that's what's so interesting to me, too, about the ways in which certain kinds of, apparatuses that are practiced, it takes an enormous privilege to not have that interrupted for you in a certain kind of way. And once you have certain kinds of interruptions by these infrastructures because you're working against the grain of how they operate, you start to see the ways in which this just is not the classical linear clock time being operated, but actually there are interruptions of this all the time.
No, I think that's really deep, because we talk a lot about how time can be oppressive within court systems, and or telling a story, and you have children that tell a story, and they're going to start with what was the most fascinating thing. That could be the flower, that they saw. It's not going to be this, okay, we had breakfast, and then we moved into this, the next subjects. So this kind of idea to have this kind of flexibility of, okay, well, how was your day? Or, and really testing that or troubling that notion of how do we speak to each other, There was something else I was thinking of, but I forgot. But do you want to have a final word on this, or what? What?
Time is up.
Wow. Thank you so much. Out new books coming from these two lovely people. My book is a poetry book.
People like poetry.
I don't know if people still love poetry,
Totally.
but it'll be out next year, so please check for it.